Мене звати Ірина Косе, я координатор частини проекту, який
My name is Irina Kose, and I'm a coordinator of part of the project that is related to the analysis efforts as for the progress of Ukraine in acquis adaptation. This project is called Integration within the Framework of Association. We're very grateful that you came here. We're very grateful to all the speakers that are going to be presenting today. We're very grateful to our online participants for listening to us today. I'm going to be moderating our today's event, so please be active in this discussion, prepare your questions. Our participants online as well, your questions will be transferred to speakers, and in the beginning, I would like to give the floor to Executive Director of Institute of Economic Research and Policy Consulting, Oksana Kuzakov. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming to this event. And I think that today it has to be interesting, very interesting, especially including, I think, the latest events that are unfolding in the world and in the country with a speed that we could not have imagined before. Within this context, the role of civil society, because today we are performing as civil society, the expert part of it, that is analyzing the accession of Ukraine or the path of Ukraine to EU, and we've been doing that for a long time. And that today, what we're going to be presenting with great pleasure to everyone. This is the 6th edition of a book that I believe that will be and is very useful in the sense of understanding how this progress happens. And it is very important, I believe, in this. There are a lot of different voices in this regard that are talking about how exactly this path is happening. And it's very important that civil society, that is the driver in Ukraine, this controller, this executor of the changes that have been taking place in the country for the last probably 15 years, I would say. And it's very important that here we're going to have this voice, and everyone will have an opportunity to discuss, to ask questions. And I think that there's such platform for dialogue that we're very grateful to have for our partners, International Renaissance Foundation. And so in this in this not calm time, so thank you for working with us. Thank you, Oksana, for all the wishes. I also want to join all the words of appreciation towards the International Renaissance Foundation that has been supporting us year to year in this work, and this work has been also preparing with the financial support of the foundation. So I'm happy to give the floor to Mr. Dmytro Shulga, who is director of the Europe and the World program. Thank you very much. We are talking today about integration of Ukraine into European Union and accession to European Union, understanding that quite a big part of this process, this is access to common market of EU, and bringing our legislation, aligning it with the European acquis. And we're going to be talking a lot about the agreement association, because 10 years ago it was signed, and even though it was not foreseeing a prospect of membership, and it was not providing a candidate status, but it was foreseeing integration in many sectors of common market of EU. Those things were not very obvious, to be honest, and throughout many years we had to talk about the the content of the association agreement in Ukraine, in Brussels, in European Union, other capitals, and to explain at the expertise level what is foreseen there. And if Ukraine does their homework, then European Union has to integrate Ukraine in different segments of common market. Now, of course, it is much broader process. And of course, now it has more political weight because we are talking about this mega task and a huge win. If everything is going to be good, then the accession of Ukraine to European Union, this is the biggest political incentive there that could be there for us to finally do the homework from our side in all the sectors we've been discussing. I would also add a few remarks, maybe, that within the discussions with EU, we also need to remind about some other quite obvious things. If we talk about the language of numbers, that this is a beneficial process for European Union, because not only Ukraine is getting their benefits from the integration, but also European Union is already gaining those benefits. And as we can see, for many stakeholders in European Union, it feels like they have opened for them, they discovered for themselves that Ukraine is integrating into EU's market with the preference in 2022. And with a further unhappiness in many sectors, many stakeholders, and in particular agrarian sector in European Union and transport. And then this is an interesting situation because many things that happened, they were foreseen within the association agreement, within the zone of trade as well, especially if we're moving into accession. We have to continue explaining to our colleagues in European Union that this is a process that is beneficial to them, first of all. And we can see the statistics for the last years. Our export to European Union stays within the same scope. And correct me if I'm wrong. I think from 2021 we were able, with of course a huge support from EU, to keep the scope of export to EU, which is a great achievement because we are a country at war and occupied territories and physical damage. And so on the other side, European Union, even for the recent years, is increasing export from European Union, so they actually benefit more and more from trading with us. And my hypothesis, not as a specialist or economist, that those benefits must grow. And it's interesting to hear if you agree. And also I was interested in this point, and I think we will also open up discussion during these presentations, but looking at the draft of the document, where it says that in many sectors, actually, if we do what we have foreseen in the association agreements, then we will pretty much will have done everything that we need to do within the framework of negotiations with EU. Not all the sectors, but that's very interesting because the association agreement has to be implemented throughout all the sectors, and it's almost, and most of the cases, it's 3-5 years and more from when the association agreement came into force. And technically we're out of this time for our homework, and mostly we're not there yet. And we say in many sectors we're almost, but this almost hasn't been fully completed. So an interesting question here is whether we can mobilize ourselves and push it through this almost and show and have European Union recognize what has to be done. And as far As we see, as I say, the events are unfolding very quickly around Ukraine and us, and this only highlights the need for our accelerated movement and moving towards our goals. And thank you for your work, for what you prepared, and I hope for very fruitful discussion. And I think it's going to be more clear after this discussion, even though, to be honest, every research only creates more questions rather than what we have had before. But quality questions, they bring us to those solutions that have to be met from two sides. Thank you. Thank you, Dmytro. We have another opening remark from Yanis Aizalniks. He is the team leader for socio-economic policy in European Commission. Mr. Yanis is online with us. Thank you, Mr. Yanis, for joining us. Please, I'm giving the floor to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and giving a floor. This is absolutely a fascinating theme to discuss services. I wanted to start by actually thanking Institute for Economic Research and Policy Consulting. I must say that not only this discussion, but countless many discussions in the past that you have been organized have been very rich, productive and really useful for the process in which we are. I wanted to acknowledge also the extremely challenging circumstances under which Ukraine is delivering reforms in financial services, digital services, which also includes aspects such as recognition of professional qualifications and customs. And this is all, of course, happening while Russia is conducting full-scale aggression against Ukraine, and you are having provisions of the martial law in place that are also limiting some of the functions of these policy areas. I also wanted to just say that for the latest developments that are happening since yesterday, EU has spoken out, and our High Representative has already shared our position, which is that the EU shares the goal of supporting Ukraine and comprehensive and achieving comprehensive, lasting peace, which guarantees the interests of Ukraine and the European Union. Of course, in the meantime, we continue working on advancing the EU accession process for Ukraine, which for now entails screening of the EU legislation across all the 33 chapters of EU law, so 33 that we can even screen. So, by the way, we are today here in Brussels screening specific chapter of the financial services, so exactly the topic of our discussion in part. I've stepped out of that meeting. Actually, we have a lunchtime at the moment, so it's very convenient to discuss as we are on it. Particularly on the services chapter, which is chapter 3, right of establishment and freedom to provide services. The screening of this particular set of legislation has already taken place, so we looked at it already during 2 days in November. And it is part of the so-called cluster 2 internal market. So as I will later mention, it's one of the basic freedoms of the single market. But services as such is so vast and broad that it's also scattered in other chapters of the EU law. So as I said, on financial services specifically, the bilateral screening meeting for chapter 9 on financial services is taking place today and tomorrow, and we are gonna then have much more information from the Ukrainian authorities as for the way forward and the state of play for the alignment. But I just wanted to start by highlighting some facts and an importance of this services sector, which in my view personally has been very much neglected so far, maybe in our conversations and our cooperation, especially given the significance of this sector. As I said, it's one of the 4 freedoms of the EU single market. Services are crucial for the EU economy. They account for 70% of the EU GDP and also pretty much the same amount of the EU employment. And our idea is that we should be removing all the barriers for companies looking to offer cross-border services and to make it easier for them to do business across the borders. So the core principles governing the single market for services are, in fact, the freedom to establish company in another EU country, and the freedom to provide services and to receive services in another EU country than the one where consumer or company is located. So this is something, the basic elements. And I mean, of course, EU is a historic project that has been evolving over decades now. And in fact, it all started with a number of judgments of the EU Court of Justice, which were then on this provision of the services across the borders, which was then codified in the EU law with a very famous directive, adoption of the Services Directive in 2006. So this directive covers services activities accounting to around 46% of EU GDP. Just to tell you that Services Directive does not cover all the services. So there are a number of services that are covered by other EU laws. So for example, financial services, and others are having their specific legislation. But in any case, the provisions of this Services Directive are aiming and should remove all the bureaucracy, or as much as possible, bureaucracy, and simplify the establishment of service providers in their home country and abroad, and simplify the cross-border provision of these services in other EU countries, and strengthen the rights of service recipients, in particular consumers, and ensure easier access to wider range of services. At the moment, as I mentioned, the significance of the service sector is large, and it's not large for the GDP that it creates and for the employment that it creates, but actually it is also very large for the EU export. So EU is also one of the largest exporters of services, and this side of the trade in services is actually creating something like 25% of the EU GDP, exceeding 900 billion euros per year. And a staggering number of 21 million jobs in EU are really linked to the export of services. There are obviously differences among the EU member states. We are all different, and also in relation to services, this is the case. I mean, for example, just the EU member state that I know the best is my country, Latvia, and the Latvian economy is driven very much by the services sector, which contributes to about 62% of GDP and employs about 70% of the population. And thanks to the services regulation, Latvia has, for example, developed a large financial services sector, and but it was not always the case. If we look at the structure of economy some 30 years ago, it was significantly less. And if we look at the growth that has happened over past 30 years, then the growth of the past 3 decades can be very much attributed to the development of this service sector. So this favorable growth has been possible due to the conditions for development of services rooted in the EU policy framework. So this is also, my maybe first message also to look at the future of development of this sector and root it in the EU policy and legislative framework. And this is precisely what we are on the way to do. And for now, where does Ukraine stand for this services sector? We are constantly assessing candidate countries, and so we do also screen the Ukrainian legal framework and state of play for services. And in this regard, we consider that Ukraine has some level of preparation in relation to the right of establishment and freedom to provide services. And that despite the difficult circumstances in the past year, Ukraine has actually been making some limited progress in this chapter, so advancing closer to the EU framework on services, and in particular, it was covering where we have seen progress. It was on the postal services in particular. I wanted to emphasize the opportunities for integration into EU services market based on the provisions of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement and Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Area, DCFTA. So Dmytro already mentioned DCFTA. I think it is hugely important. Also, because of the fact that DCFTA is going to be, in reality, the legal framework for our cooperation that's going to stay in force right until the day of accession. So, of course, on the day of accession, Ukraine will have to comply with all the legal framework, and Ukraine will get access to the internal market. But before the day of accession, DCFTA is our provision or our framework in place, and it does provide some opportunities, and these opportunities are so far untapped, definitely. And so DCFTA provides possibility for internal market treatment of Ukrainian services in 4 categories, namely financial services, telecommunications, postal and maritime services. If capitalized on this opportunity, the integration in the single market in each area can be granted even before the accession. However, of course, in order to achieve this internal market treatment, Ukraine has to already now, before accession, adopt and implement the legislation that is governing this sector inside the EU, because, of course, this is an access to the internal market, and the internal market and integrity of the internal market requires that everybody is playing along the same rules and is governed by the same policy framework. I wanted also to emphasize that that outside, these elements of service provision, and in order to advance them, we also need to align on the aspect that is relating to the recognition of professional qualifications, because, of course, in order to provide services, we need to be sure that the qualifications of the Ukrainian service providers are up to the same standards or up to the level of the standards in other countries. So I think the first step here would be that we would need to proceed with the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. We have been working to ensure transparency and compatibility between regulatory systems in EU and Ukraine, but we need to make some steps to arrive to that. The legislation and approach followed by Ukraine obviously varies depending on a sector here, and further efforts we see that would be needed to align in particular with the minimum training requirements. There is a directive on the minimum training required professions. There's a specific directive on the movement of lawyers and the directive on a proportionality test before adopting a new regulation of professions. So as I said, at the moment, we don't have this mutual recognition of professional qualifications between Ukraine and EU, and it's something that we need to work on. In 2024 enlargement report, we also obviously covered financial services, which is a separate topic, although closely related. And there we have, in fact, the same level as in general services, so which is same level of some level of preparation, and Ukraine has made some progress during this past year, and we believe that Ukraine has been following up on the recommendations that we had made a year before. So we are advancing a bit faster on financial services, which, as I said, is also one of the areas where we could talk about the internal market treatment. I would like to also say that Ukraine has a very strong basis to work in financial services, and this is something that we are discussing today It is, of course, admirable how during these difficult conditions during the war, Ukraine has been able to maintain a stable banking system and provide financial services to its population. This is also, I think, very telling about the resilience of the system, and I think, as such, a very good basis for further strengthening the system in terms of legislative alignment to the EU regulations, which would eventually then lead to ability to work on the EU internal market. I think we're going to see one of the first aspects of financial services, Ukraine in foreseeable future joining SEPA, which is in fact a mechanism of fast payments between the EU and Ukrainian banks, which would already give a confidence to the consumers, and would also mean that Ukraine has aligned very much with the legislation that is required to work in this area. Since we are also discussing customs today, I wanted to say a couple of words about the customs. We consider that Ukraine has a good level of preparation with regards to the customs union, and made good progress so far in aligning the legislation. Ukraine has done some changes to its customs code, which has brought it closer to the EU customs code. But we know that there are still some work to be done, and we are in a close cooperation with the State Customs Committee, State Customs Service, to work further on the complete alignment of the customs code, and introducing other aspects that will bring us very much closer together. Very briefly, I wanted also to touch base on a future of the services, because every sector in the EU is not static. Everything is a little bit changing and evolving. As I said, the Services Directive came about in 2006, but we are now in 2025, and the world is changing, and EU is catching up and trying to be proactively making favorable conditions. As you know, we have a new European Commission in place since 1st of December. A new European Commission has also been taking positions on how to ensure a favorable business environment for all sectors in the European Union. Commission has adopted its new work program, where services sector is also featuring rather strong. And this program is namely saying that our single market will be a central part of our future competitiveness. And one of the greatest achievements of this single market, obviously, fuels our economic growth and makes our day-to-day life easier for European businesses and consumers. And with a single market strategy, we will present a new horizontal strategy for modernizing single market, and it will set a clear path towards further facilitating the cross-border provision of services and goods. So this aspect of provision of services is going to be scrutinized, and we are going to try to see and identify what kind of obstacles we still have in the market, and how we can address them. And this strategy will also look at the full implementation of the existing rules, and at the elimination of the barriers to boost the potential of our businesses. There are certain sectors also that we are going to target specifically.
I'm sorry, I'll have to stop you here, because we won't have enough time for all our discussion.
Thank you. Apologies for a little bit long intervention, but thank you so much.
Just a couple of,
Yeah, thank you so much. This is, in fact, what I wanted to say, and I look forward to the discussion today, and happy to hear the reflections and opinions on this area. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yanis. Дякую, Янісу, за такий.
Thank you, Yanis, for such a very good and comprehensive overview. This actually shortened part of my presentation because I had my speech. But I'm going to ask to put the presentation on the screen. In particular, this is the slide with QR code, please. Or you can, next slide, please. where you so if you follow this QR code, you will be able to download the draft of our report. In this report, we have looked through 15 sectors. Of course, this is not a comprehensive list from the association agreement, but it's those sectors where Ukraine, when have completed all the requirements when it gets to association agreement, will at the same time complete almost all the requirements that we have as for the accession. First of all, we wanted to look into progress in all the sectors. The second thing, if there are any gaps between the requirements for membership and government plans, and how the association agreement ensures full complete alignment when it gets to criteria of membership. I'm going to summarize very briefly this report, what sectors we believe to be the most integrated. So this is financial services, telecommunication, postal services, energy, and public procurement. Ukraine has implemented most of the commitments in those areas. Financial sector almost fully harmonized with European regulations. Telecommunication, we're moving to digital visa-free system. I'm not going to talk about this too much right now because we're going to speak about this today as well. Maybe during the discussion, we will come to a different conclusion. Also, postal and courier services, they almost are aligned with the directives of EU. Energy, we're already integrated into European market of electricity and gas. Nevertheless, we still need further liberalization, and also in procurement, we need to finalize the bill. We have this work ongoing, but we also expect significant progress this year. Next steps, what do we expect in at least 2025? What is so significant? Where can we progress? First of all, this is ACA agreement. So this is industrial visa-free system, so to say. As for 3 sectors, it's only 3 sectors. We would like to have more, but we expect that at least 3 sectors will get the agreement signed. We also expect to get connected to roaming space, and also signing the agreement about mutual recognition of digital services, and also public procurement. And the same, unfortunately, I will say only the same expectations we had when we were preparing the previous version of the report. So the progress of Ukraine within these 2 years, let's say something was getting done, but it was not enough. For this time, Ukraine has successfully completed only one point that I didn't mention, is authorized economic operators, and partially I would say, but I think Andriy Budin will cover that in more detail. So our key recommendations, if we were providing them for each sector, but if we combine them into one piece, it would be general recommendations that you have heard, you know about this. First of all, to update agenda according to the status of Ukraine, finalize harmonization, and remove gaps. Very important to strengthen institutional capacity and recover technical capacity, in particular infrastructure sector. Very important to have dialogue with stakeholders, not only here in Ukraine, but also in EU. Also, transparent monitoring, progress assessment, engagement of civil society. These are also part of our recommendations. I'm not going to take more time from our panelists, so let's go to the discussion. And the discussion is going to be opened with customs. This is not a classic service of the sector of services, but they're very close to the sector. So that's why I want to invite Andriy Budin, who's a senior expert at IER, and online we're going to have Alexander Moskalenko. Alexander Moskalenko is going to be online, and Vladislav Suvorov, who is the deputy head of State Customs Service of Ukraine. Please. So I will just stand here for me to see the screen. I'm going to try to, since we have to catch up with our schedule a little bit. So just a few words how this book is different from the previous ones, because as you can see, this is edition number 6, and I must say that it has included not only the association agreement, but also things that are connected with the process of accession. And that's why it contains, so to say, oh, sorry, I see a, yeah, so it contains the points that were connected to the association agreements and some points that we have to do when we talk about the accession process to EU and the negotiation process itself. That's why it is combining these two elements. On the other side, if you look into sections, as much as it's possible, it is written in simple language. So a person who just wants to get acquainted with those sections that they're interested in can easily read this and get to know how close are we to European acquis and how are we progressing in different sectors. So on the one hand, the book and some sections, on the one hand, it is written as simply as possible in simple language. On the other hand, you also have an opportunity to see reference to special acts and references to specific documents, and what we're talking about here is highlighted. So we analyzed 2023-2024, hence task of Ukraine was put into relevant recommendation from European Commission, relevant in the respective 23-2024. And in 2023-2024, it was highlighted, recognized significant progress within 29th and section 29th, so custom union, and this was also done with the introduction of NCTS as well, and certain changes in customs code and authorized economic operators. And except for this, we also have here on the next slide, I'm going to show you, for example, criminalization of contraband as well, and it was also assessed as a big plus for Ukraine. And governmental report that was published in the end of 2023, it shows that in customs in this sector we have completed 60% of what was supposed to be done. What exactly was done? Of course, you can see it in the reports and you can see the details, but the key points: in December, we have introduced criminal liability for smuggling, and how is it done and how is it implemented and how was it affecting the situation? We can talk about this separately and we can dedicate a whole other event for this, but also we're talking about such things that are connected to customs with the it's introduction of national revenue strategy. Also, we have endorsed the plan of digitalization of the state customs service that includes certain orientation points that the EU uses. And here we're going to the development of NCTS that Ukraine had to also implement in the last year. This is going to phase 5 using common transit, and here we're progressing quite well, and thankful to this. Mostly we have received quite an endorsing feedback about the requirements last year. Also, there is a progress in parallel undergoing in developing new national IT systems. Of course, it's quite a lot of work, and even if we have some systems, you need to improve them. So it's quite a never-stopping process. And we also said that in September 2024, a very big update in law and customs clearance was also adopted. And we're not going to talk about this in the details, but the State Customs Service, along with the Ministry of Finance and the Business Association, they're working on how to implement this. And I must say that there's certain peculiarity for the Customs Service, for the government, and I'm going to talk about this later, but also they're preparing some global changes to the customs code. So in fact, new customs code. On the other side, they have to implement the changes they had already already introduced. So this is quite a complex process. If you understand how it's happening in this such services, we also need to consult with business associations. So it's very, very, very complicated process. And of course, we should mention this law, so-called law on resetting the customs, and this is raising the salaries for the personnel and changing procedures and so on. But it is within the context of capacity of the state customs service to implement their functions, and this is also one of the tasks within the agreement and requirements for our accession to EU. What else has to be done? So those things that were pointed out in the report of European Commission. As for finalization of endorsement of updated customs code, and here I want to say about the association agreement, it was not foreseen fully endorsement of all the regulations that exist in the code, in custom code in European Union. On the other hand, we have a different reality, and now we must fully adopt this new customs code that will be aligning with the regulation of EU. And the third thing, that also it is constantly undergoing certain change, and we need to be ready that when we are adopting some previous version, we need to keep in mind that we might have some new version of those regulations that are going to be part of it. And also we are saying here that we need to implement those goals of customs code that had been endorsed already, because this is quite massive, but it has to be quite heavy on regulation base. And also digitalization of state customs service. This is quite a comprehensive process, and I think the representatives from state customs, they will talk about this more. And then expansion process from phase 5 to phase 6 of NCTS, it's going to be this year. And also what Ira mentioned, autonomous authorized economic operators. But there are certain issues when we talk about recognition of such enterprises from the EU side. We have to reach this indicator on those enterprises with category B, so-called. So, and the last, it is the improvement of administrative capacity of the state customs service, and what is going to be shown from the law that was endorsed last year. And our recommendations are here. I'm gonna stop here for a little bit to talk about those recommendations. So for the EU, support the Ukrainian side in developing and further implementing the EU customs code into Ukrainian legislation, then continue assisting and strengthening the capacity of the state customs service of Ukraine, particularly through technical assistance projects aimed at equipping custom officers, offices, appointing a new head of the state customs service, improving personnel qualification, ensuring public oversight in custom activities, and also continue supporting the Ukrainian side in developing and implementing customs IT systems and digitalizing customs operations. So to be very brief here, I will stop. Thank you, Andriy. And to respond, to react to this analysis, I'm gonna ask Mr. Vladislav Suvorov, who is online with us, and he's Deputy Head of State Customs Service of Ukraine. Please, do you hear us, Vladislav? Yes, I hear you. Do you hear me? Yes, we hear you, but we don't see you yet. Now we see you. Hello, dear participants, dear guests, and thank you for inviting me to such an important event. I'm going to be talking on behalf of two people, for Alexander Petrovich Mosklenko, because he at this point had to go to a meeting of Verkhovna Rada of the Parliament as for the draft 10.57. But in principle, along with the Ministry of Finance, we are jointly moving on this path towards European integration and the customs component. If we talk about the context of our today's meeting, association agreement for us is Annex 15 that foresees four key measures that have to be done. First, to implement certain regulations of, at that point, modernized customs code, and there were three stages of approximation: is full implementation of customs legislation, then partially, and the third was not applicable. And in 2021, we updated those points where we had to conduct implementation to EU's customs code 930 regulation, and pretty much 80% we have completed our commitments when it gets to implementation of certain points within the topic of customs code of EU. Why it happened this way? Because we were going part to part and breaking down the customs legislation, and at some point we understood that by partial changes to amendments to customs code, we will not be able to reach our goal, and we need to develop a whole comprehensive plan of measures that is going to align the customs code to the EU's one. And I will talk a little bit later about the work that is ongoing right now, and in the next 15 that is foreseeing accession of Ukraine to a convention on the procedure of joint transit as well, and simplification of this formalization and trade. And we also heard about this today, about the new computerized transit system, and we have gone through this hard path, and these conventions are not they are close, so to join them, the government will is not enough. We also need to do a lot of work and to get the decision of a joint committee, and that is proceeded with a monitoring process. And I want to remind you that Ukraine became the 36th participant from 2022, and including the war, still Ukraine has conducted their analysis. And the third document within the framework of 608 regulation, when it gets to promoting rights for intellectual property, that was implemented in 2019, and this was covered this way. And the last fourth block is regulation 1186. This is quite a heavy block that we're going to be implementing a new customs code, and respectively, this is our new commitments, new responsibilities as customs. And what is happening right now when we talk about getting candidacy? So after this happened, in the end of 2023, national strategy, revenue strategy was endorsed for 2024 and 2030. If you look at this customs component, this is about administrating customs component. In this document, the focus goes to issues connected to complex and comprehensive reforming of state customs service, and working with this institution, working with corruption, and working with smuggling. And one of the elements of this customs component is, of course, harmonization of customs legislation of Ukraine, aligning it with European acquis. And in this context, as it was also mentioned, in February 2024, the Ministry of Finance created 15 expert teams that almost, well, in fact, they have been working for 1 year on a new version of customs code, and they consist of experts from state customs service and our partners that support reform of Ministry of Finance and PFA as well, that is covering a lot of activities, not only this one. Also, another important document that was endorsed in February 2024 as well. This is a document that foresees approval of strategic plan of developing of informational technologies in state customs service to 2028, that is basing on multi-annual strategic plan of development development of IT in European Union. And here I want to say a very important aspect. We all understand the Section 29 of a negotiation process. So historically, revolutionary European Union, it was after deep and comprehensive free trade area, which helped to form customs union. First of all, this is single rule, single conditions, and I will tell you that if we cannot do this, we cannot talk about anything else further. And such important aspects as I mentioned, this is code, customs code, and very important effects in European Union. The functioning of provisions of customs code is ensured by informational systems, and there are 17 key ones, 16 additional ones that we need to either build from the scratch or we need to rebuild the existing ones if we have understanding of how it works in European Union, because there are some closed off systems that, for example, ensure the analysis of risks system, and we don't have functional or technical requirements. They are closed off in European Union. And this direct plan that was endorsed by the Ministry of Finance, I'm happy to say that last year we were able to either build or to rebuild 4 systems that were built in line with requirements of European Union, starting with NCTS, that is ensuring common transit and also commitment and guarantee management and decision making system. So this is second block, and third block, this is institutional capacity of state customs service as an institution to ensure compliance with customs rules of European Union. And here I'm going to, in fact, third recommendation and enlargement report. And here we have 3 recommendation: IT, legal, and HR. And in fact, HR is going to be directed by this law on resetting, which we already discussed today. And I was supporting it till the end, to be honest, but there's the salary component that is the key incentive at this point, and the key corruption also factor, unfortunately, and it's not included in our institution to the fullest as we had planned. So there are some risks that with the professionals within the framework of those measures that are foreseen by this draft law. And this law foresees not only the process of selection of a new head, but also re-attestation of the senior officers in the service and polygraph. And here I'm going to stop. I think, yes, Vladislav, unfortunately, I was almost ready to interrupt you. I think that we will not be able to have questions from the audience because we are running late in our program. So thank you, all of our speakers who talked about customs. And now we're going to our next section. This is recognition of professional qualification. And I want to also invite our speakers that are going to talk about this. Alexandra will start here. Alexandra, do you have your clicker?
Вітаю всіх.
Hello, everyone. So after customs that are still connected to all of us, but we are going to the section of our book that is different from others because this is not a separate chapter. This is not a separate chapter of negotiations, Ukraine and EU. This is about a few sections and many sections. And as our colleague from European Commission rightfully mentioned, this is more of a human-oriented section because it's pretty much about all of us. Let me understand how I need to click the slides here. So for any reforms that are done in Ukraine, they are foremost are done for people, or most of them, so to say. So why do we need to recognize qualification? This is the name of this section of the book. Why is it important? It is important for us as for employees, because it's also access to labor market, and it's also Europeans that can get access to our market. And this is also increased mobility and career growth opportunity, not only one way, but two ways, and also official recognition of experience and qualification obtained in Ukraine and other countries. And it's very important for us because many Ukrainian citizens, they are abroad, and we hope that they're gonna also come back with new qualification that they can show in the documents. And it's also for the business, this is access to more qualified employees with correct skills, because Ukrainian business is complaining that there are not enough professionals, and we have skills mismatch, which is a big problem in Ukraine. So changes in the process of recognition of qualification can fix this. And when we talk about institutions, educational institutions, that means that we need to have the reform in education, right? So that means a change of curriculum. What are we teaching in our institutions? And that means that our educational institutions, they will be more competitive, and more foreign students can come here as well. And of course, this is all assuming that our security situation improves. And for the state, it is very clear. It's a simplification of returning Ukrainians to Ukraine, and it's also strengthening the economy. This is labor force, and we're going to be meeting European standards. So recognition of qualification touches on a few sections of negotiations. So there's no separate section that is talking about this. This is, for example, Chapter 2, free movement of workers. And I want to say it's very important for business as well, because that means that our labor market is going to be open for all Europeans that are going to come here, because once again, we just need to know how to recognize the qualification, and we will be able to hire them. We will not need to go to migration service to ask if we can hire someone from EU. Then Chapter 3, freedom of establishment and provision of services, and Chapter 26, education and culture. How is it different from previous sections? Before, we were looking into this as part of Chapter 26, but now we understand that Chapter 2 and 3, they're very important when it gets to qualification area. So the key EU acts you can see on the slide. You can also get more details in the research paper. And there are some directives. Part of them are in the legislation part. No. And generally, for the last years, a lot of work has been done in the area of qualification. A national agency on qualification was created that hadn't been there before, and also developed separate professional standards, qualificational centers that can also create pretty much they can work. So for example, a UAV, you can get a certificate that you can fly on something. I'm just saying this is very dynamic process, and it's developing, and business can have leading role in this. Also, legislative act on professional training and education. Also, that representatives from EU, they can also study here. Very important is draft bill on national framework of qualification. You can find it in the report. It is not fully including the directive, but it's significantly progressing towards us. So what we pretty much need to do here, we need to develop qualification centers. We need to develop the standards, and it's very important that business works with the government, since it is also connected to a few ministries, and this is Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Education. The cooperation of government with business is crucial here, and educational institutions, of course. So for the nearest future, we need to endorse the law. We also need to prepare the reports on compliance of National Council of Qualification to European Framework of Qualification, and this is a report is being prepared. We also need to introduce system of monitoring in qualification centers and also reforms in the area of education, and we need some changes in the area of education, vocational, for example, component, and so on. For EU, of course, support, and it would be very good that EU continues providing support in the changes in qualification standards. And here I'm going to give the microphone to Ms. Daria as well. And thank you, colleagues. I'm very happy to be here and talking about such important topic. I'm gonna try to be very concise since we are following behind our schedule. I want to say that the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine is leader when it gets to sections, negotiation sections that we already mentioned. This is free movement of workers and provision of services, respectively. In November last year, we had screening meetings in Brussels, and our department was directly involved in two chapters. Those two chapters. So as for qualification, recognition of qualification, I must say the following: within the context of screening, this sub-block, so to say, of negotiation block, it was reviewed in the context of the third section, even though we're sure that this is the base for free movement of employees, and despite what negotiation block it's going to be relating to, we are sure that we have a lot of work, and this is a foundational matter for European integration for Ukraine. In Brussels, we presented the analysis that we had conducted as for the alignment of our legislation and the alignment with the directive on mutual recognition of qualification, and we also presented a specific plan of action on what is going to be done to remove the gaps. And I must say that a lot of progress has already been conducted, and we still need to do a lot of conceptual things. And for this, the Ministry of Economy is doing work on creation of relevant working group, and we want this group to be as inclusive as possible and taking into consideration the interest of all the parties, since it's going to be specifically dedicated to the implementation of this basic directive. But within this section, we were discussing not only Directive 36, but also European professional card and proportion test. To be honest, this is quite an interesting thing that is only being implemented in EU. But our European colleagues, they encourage us to already start a discussion on the correct approach to use this test, and this brings us to the question of regulated professions. At this point, our legislation doesn't have the definition for regulated professions, but according to our calculation, we have 25 professional groups within which we can also highlight 150 professions and specialties that have certain characteristics of regulated ones. Our task is to regulate this because it's going to be quite sensitive, because we understand that regulated professions, this is the balance between access to profession, economic interest, and value for public. And that's why we hope for constructive discussion on this matter. Also, I would like to cover the issue with European professional card. This is something very new for Ukraine. So it is a principle that the new economy now has to develop the plan of actions to implement such cards. And we hope that soon is going to be relevant project will be brought to the government. Also, when we talk about recognition of qualification, we must mention the profession classification. And this is section 18, statistics. We understand that this is the foundation and our task to align our classifier of professions with the European ones, and the Ministry of Economy is conducting work in this regard. By the end of February, we are going to have a comparison table, and then it's going to be the most part and sensitive part, which involves directly breaking down the professions into new levels. And we have more than 9,000 professions, part of which should be reviewed or excluded or updated. We believe that no one can know better about the sector if not the employers. So we will also make sure to engage them in this process. And here I'm going to stop. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions. Thank you, Ms. Daria. Maybe we have very short questions, maybe. If no, just a quick question, if I may. There are two key questions, not two, but there are a lot of them. But what Ms. Daria mentioned, so there's a proportionality test, so to identify the professions that we want to regulate. And European professional card, this is the opposite, automatic recognition of qualification. So there's this space where the states, they can identify their own peculiarities that are not in the directive. So here it's going to be a question to employers: where do we want to regulate harder, and also to the government, and where do we want it on automatic? And where it's automatic, we of course need professional standard that is in line with European qualification centers must be that are recognized, and also additionally that the education programs, they also get correlated. Okay, thank you. Okay, do we have the microphone for the audience? Please.
Вибачте, для іноземця, що це кваліфікаційний центр?
For foreigner, what is it, qualification center? Is it system of education? Because, for example, you must adopt or to compare your professions with Austrian ones, with European ones. So this is a question to education. How exactly are you going to do this? Because, for example, partners, or how exactly are you going to do that? What thoughts do you have? What can you share? What professions you can align with standards? By the way, chefs, this was one of the first qualification centers that was done of professional standards in Ukraine for chefs, professional chefs, because this is the development of professional standard that has to align with European professional standard, and the qualification center on their base that once again received certificate and the permit to check this professional standard. They are checking that whether really the person that has this relevant qualification has that. So they're told to cook something, to make something. So there's some practical skills and theoretical skills. For example, if you go back to UAV example, there's a separate qualification center. They have a certificate to check relevant skills according to certain professional standard. They're not checking all the UAV, just separate ones. And what is the center? This is a separate institution. A business can create qualification center, but the most important part is for them to have they work together with the national qualification agency, and they're getting the certificate that they can check this or that standard. But one qualification center, they cannot do everything. They only can cover certain areas that they can do. Thank you very much. I think we're going to finish this part of the question. We're going to go to next sector, and I'm happy to welcome Ms. Olga Krevska. She's the director of the Directorate for for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, international cooperation at the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine. She's going to join us when we are going to talk about digital services. Now I want to invite Vitaly Kravchuk. We are going into financial services, and we are going to have Yana Oklimenko, who's a senior economist at the CES. So you should have the clicker there for your presentation. Vitaly, please start.
Куди треба клікати?
Where do I click?
Ага, окей, працює. Так, чудово.
Great.
Так,
So-
так. Добре. Отже,
So
фінансовий послуги – це дійсно один
financial
з таких
services,
великих
it is
секторів,
indeed
де
one
достатньо
of
велике
those
домашнє
big
завдання.
sectors where we have
України.
quite a lot of homework
Як
for
дійсно вже
Ukraine.
Іра
And
відзначала,
As
прогрес є,
Irina rightfully
але і
mentioned,
домашнє
there is
завдання теж
progress,
велике, тому
but
що
homework is also
тому що
quite big
законодавство є, бо
because the
навіть вже з
legislation
часу,
of
коли були проведені переговори
EU,
про
even
асоціацію,
from the
вже
point of view of
з того
negotiations,
часу вже
association
скликані ці
agreements, since
наступний пакет
then
законодавства,
EU
який
had
є
they managed to also adopt quite a big package of legislation that was addressing big financial crisis in 2008-2009 that had to modernize regulation of financial services sector that added a certain amount of centralized regulations on the level of EU, and also there was change in the model of monitoring an overview over the financial sector. Also COVID, then the Green Deal that foresaw changes in regulation of financial sector, for example, as for disclosure and climate impact from the side of financial instruments, and also there's work done on many other matters. So yes, the progress is there. For example, when we talk about regulation of banks, both Ukraine and EU, they're working on the same standard that is recognized on the world level by Basel Committee on Banking Supervision.
ЄС просунувся значно
As
більше.
key regulators of
ніж
developed
Україна.
countries.
Випадку ЄС,
Of course, EU has progressed much more than Ukraine,
останні
and EU, starting from the 1st of January,
частини пакету Базель 3, так званого,
completed most of the indicators of the last part of this package, basic package Basel 3. That was adopted in the beginning after the financial crisis in 2010. And also, Ukraine is progressing in this area, starting from the 1st of January. For example, a provision on the capital was adopted for banks, and a lot of things are still there to do. So in each subsector, this is banking sector, insurance, and capital markets, there is progress as well. And here I'm saying not about the last 2 years, but more from the moment of signing of association agreement. Each sector has significant progress, for example, but still, of course, the war and COVID bring in their corrections into the process and the schedule from the Ukrainian side. In banking sector, so the implementation was mostly done within the framework of the National Bank work, even though there were some amendments to the legislation that, for example, also allowed 3-level structure of capital, but there's progress. And as it was mentioned already, the homework is getting bigger because the regulation is updated from the side of EU. When we talk about insurance, before the beginning of full-scale invasion, we had adopted a new law on insurance that by the fact that the regulation was given to the National Bank, it is actively being implemented, and it is mostly implemented by this time for the last years. So also the key important part of profile solvency directive was implemented in Ukraine partially, but also there's a lot of work. Also, capital market was quite recent changes, for example, increasing the and changes in functions, for example, functioning of capital markets. Now it's updating functioning of the National Committee of Securities and the stock market. And the Ukraine facility as well, a new law has to be implemented. We need to have the understanding of how the capital market has to look like within the recovery process of Ukraine. What tools do we have in this context and how to implement those regulations? There is also, as I said before, so the capital market, it is the internal market regime for financial services could enable the early integration of Ukraine's financial sector into the EU market. And we talk about banking sector, we quite significantly progressed to Basel III, but it's also clear that we have a lot of components that have to be introduced. They're still left for us to do. And in the end, eventually, what can it potentially end up with? As colleagues mentioned, sector financial services. This is one of the sectors where we cannot get this so-called internal market regime, which can mean local integration to EU market that can be faster than the finalization of the process of EU accession.
Якщо ми говоримо про цей режим
So
внутрішнього ринку,
if we talk about this internal market treatment,
багато кроків з
we understand that there are many steps
розділів переговорів, відкриття,
of
закриття
towards
розділів
accession. This is opening,
Ще рішення
closing,
тобто
different sections
багато
of
кроків,
negotiations,
які
many
потребують
decisions,
на
a
кожному
lot
кроці
of
одноголосного голосування
steps
з боку
that
всіх членів ЄС.
call for each step unanimous
Того, щоб просуватися по режиму
voting
внутрішнього ринку, такої
from all
одноголосності
the
не потрібно.
members
Це теж, звичайно,
of
очевидно, зрозуміло, що треба
all the
політичне
EU
рішення від
members,
основних
country members,
країн
as
ЄС,
for the
очевидно,
internal
теж
market.
без цього нікуди
We don't need
не
that
просунемось, але це, мабуть,
unanimous
простіше досягнути, ніж
stance. And of course,
повністю
this is
одноголосне це
political
рішення.
decision of
Тому якраз, мені
EU
здається,
countries. Obviously, we will not move anywhere, not progress too much without this decision. So I believe that it's important for us to move towards this regime. What is needed for this? We need to update the profile, the relevant appendix to this matter, because as I said, it was formed back at the time where there was no such big reform of legislation in EU before 2010, and it's quite obsolete. So without updating it, it's going to be really hard to assess anything, and European Commission will have to assess whether we have completed everything. So we have to execute this annex and then get positive assessment from the side of European Commission. Is going to be not only formally about the legislative acts, but also make sure that they are actually enforced, all of those regulations. So we need to have capable regulators that are going to supervise this process. And I think that financial services, maybe not the first ones, but one of the biggest volume sector where
Як би став
where
поштовхом
this
для
internal
подальшого розширення
internal market regime can
такої
work
галузевої
and
інтеграції до ринку
become the
ЄС?
push
Це, звичайно, за умови,
of
якщо
such a
затягнеться
sector
процес вступу до ЄС. Тому що, звичайно,
integration
якщо ми
into European market,
зможемо оптимістичний
subject
графік виконати по
to
вступу до єС, можливо, нам
prolongation
цей
of the
весь
of if our
режим внутрішнього ринку
process
не
of
потрібен, і
EU
ми будемо
accession will
інтегруватися
be
повністю до всього.
stretched out, and
Але
we can do
як
this
то кажуть, що
optimistic
будемо сподіватися на
scenario,
краще, але готуватися до
and we will be, of
процесу,
course,
якраз в
hoping
процесі
for the best, but
підготовка до цього
preparing
процесу, це якраз
for
може бути
such a situation where
фокус
preparation
на
for
таке
this
дотримання
process
режиму внутрішнього
can
ринку
be
для таких секторів, як, наприклад,
highlighting
сектор фінансових послуг. Дякую,
highlighting
це
this
все з мого боку.
internal regime,
Дякую,
market,
Віталію.
internal
І
market
з
regime
нами
for
пані
sector
Яна
of financial
Охріменко з
services. Thank you,
Центру
Vitaly. We
економічної
also have
стратегії.
Miss
Будь ласка,
Yana
виведіть її нам на
Akhrimenko
екран. Вона з нами в Zoom.
from the
Дякую, пані Яно, що
Center
змогли
for
до нас
Economic Strategy. Please
доєднатися.
show
Я
her on the
знаю,
screen. She's on
що
Zoom
ви
with us.
також
Thank you, Miss
робили
Yana, for
аналіз
joining us
сектору
today. I know
фінансових
that you
послуг.
also were
Тому, будь
analyzing
ласка,
the
ваші думки
sector
і
of
коментарі
financial services.
щодо
So
того, що ви
please,
почули
your
сьогодні.
thoughts, your comments on what you have
Доброго
heard
дня.
here today.
Дуже дякую за
Hello.
запрошення.
Thank you very much
Постараюся
for
бути лаконічною.
the invitation. I'm gonna try
По-перше,
to
я погоджуюся з тим, що
concise. First of
це
all, I
розділ він
agree
один із
that
найбільш
this
динамічних
section is
розділів
one of
європейського
the
АКІ.
most dynamic sections of
Ми
European acquis.
аналізували вже
We
безпосередньо ті директиви та
we've been
регламенти,
analyzing those
які
directives
нам
and
буде необхідно
regulations
транспонувати,
that
аби
we would
наблизитися вже
have
безпосередньо до
to
вступу до ЄС.
align
Власне,
with
якщо порівнювати
to
цей список
accelerate
із
towards
додатком угоди про
accession
асоціацію,
and EU.
то
So if we
фактично
compare it to
кожен
this list
нормативно-правовий
to
акт
the
було або
association
замінено, або
agreement,
змінено, або
in fact,
доповнено.
each act
І, власне,
was
коли
either
проводили консультації з відповідальними
changed
регуляторами,
or
про що ми
finalized.
говоримо
And when we
про
were running
Національну
consultations
комісію з
with
цінопідйомних
the
та фондових
regulators,
ринків, власне,
mostly
так,
talking about
ключова
National
проблема полягає
Committee
в тому,
on
що дуже часто
Securities and
законодавство
Stock
ЄС,
Market,
воно
the key
оновлюється
problem
швидше,
is
аніж
lays within the fact that quite
ми здатні
often
до нього
the
пристосуватися.
EU
Зокрема,
acquis
ми про це
is
говорили в
updating much
контексті
faster than we can
регуляції проспекту емісій
adapt
цінних
to
паперів,
it. In
але
particular, we
мені
were
здається,
talking
що
about this in the
це
context of regulation
фактично
of
до кожної
the
сфери в розділі фінансових послуг.
securities sector, but I think this is relevant
Хочу
for
зазначити,
all the
що в
spheres
самому
in
Європейському
financial
Союзі
services.
ми спостерігаємо
Secondly, I
певний
want
тренд
to mention that in the
в
European
бік
Union itself, we are
уніфікації вимог та
seeing this
стандартів,
trend towards unification of
тому
requirements
що
and
знову ж
standards,
таки цей розділ
because
він боротися
once again,
один
this
із
section turned out to be
найбільш складних
one
для
of
хармонізації вже для
the
чинних-членів
one
ЄС.
of the hardest
І
ones for
тому нові
harmonization
законодавчі акти, які ми
for
бачимо,
acting members of
це або
EU,
регламенти,
and this
або
is why
директиви,
new
доповнені
legislative
досить
acts that we're
великою
seeing, this is
кількістю
either
регламентів.
regulations or
Тобто
directives
це
that
те,
are
що ми
that are
маємо
complemented with
застосовувати в тому вигляді, як воно
a
є,
lot of
і тут, в
regulations.
принципі,
So
дуже
this is
мало
something that we need to
простору
use the way it
гнучкості
is,
для
and it's quite
транспозиції.
little space
Кілька
for
робочих
flexibility in
моментів,
transposition, and a few working
в принципі,
things.
всі ці розділи, які
So
були в
in
угоді про
principle, all of
асоціацію,
those sections
які ви
that were
описували,
there in the
вони
association agreement
переважно
that you have
збігаються
described,
з
they are
списком
mostly
акті до
aligning
імплементації
with
вже
the
в
list
рамках
of the
підготовки до
key
вступу. Але в
towards
нас є
implementation
такі
within the
дві
framework of
відмінності.
preparation to
Напевно,
accession, but
найменш
there are
значна
two
це МІКа,
significant
регулювання
differences.
віртуальних
Probably
активів,
the last
криптоактивів. Акт було прийнято в
significant, this is
23-му році,
MiCA.
в нас
This is
досить
regulation of virtual assets, crypto
те, що не
assets that was
транспоновано, в
adopted in
нас ця сфера
2023.
все ще
And here
повністю
we have
законодавчим
not
наглядом,
only trend,
тому що закон
uh,
так і не набув
not
чинності.
only we have aligned
І
with this,
другий
but it's
момент,
also
він
outside
також
of
відноситься до
legislative
replacement plan.
supervision because it's
Це
still
DORA,
not in
акт
the law is
про
not
операційну цифрову
in
стійкість.
force. And
І
the
тут, в
second one
принципі,
is DORA, is
ключова
Act
проблема
on
полягає на
Operation
тому,
Digital
що
Resilience.
це
And the
досить
key
важка
problem
тема для
is that this
багатьох
is
розділів
quite a
перемовин.
complex
Тому що,
topic for
наприклад, якщо
many
ми говоримо
sections of
про
negotiations. Because, for example,
транскордонне
if we
надання
talk
послуг,
about
про ринок послуг,
about
то ми
cross-border
маємо
service
розуміти, що
provision, the market
кібербезпека
of
та
services,
захист
we
персональних
must
даних це
understand that
передумова співпраці.
cybersecurity and personal
Те ж саме
data
стосується
protection.
багатьох
This
сфер.
is foundation for cooperation. The same goes for many spheres, financial markets. They are not an exclusion here. And we need to change the whole infrastructure fundamentally when it gets to cybersecurity and digital resilience according to the European version. So we have it now very fragmented and the responsibility is quite blurred. So we need to have a single body that is going to be implementing this and is going to be responsible for it on the national level. And then it's going to go into e-commerce and banking services, other financial services. So unfortunately, this part for us is absent, and since it is relevant to many negotiation sections, question arises: who is going to be responsible within the framework of negotiations? I also want to mention that regulatory philosophy for us quite often is absolutely different from what we see in the EU. We still don't have the culture of the safeguards. So the supervision for the market to prevent certain problems and crisis events and so on. So this monitoring with consultations and support from the side of regulatory body, especially this is relevant for National Committee of Securities and stock markets. This is unfortunately still quite weak if we compare it to the EU's ones. And here I want to agree with the speaker about the capacity of the regulator, because it's been second year that we're seeing in the reports about enlargement. We see recommendation on the strengthening of authorities of the National Committee on Securities and Stock Markets and enlargement of such duties. And despite the fact that last year there was a relevant law adopted, we need to still see some time after this that can help strengthening institution capacity, but we're not seeing this right now. And as weird as it sounds, our capital markets, if we compare it to EU, they're not just weakly developed, they're just absent. So the absence of functions of the regulator, and it is not it is creating a significant security risks and threats of crisis events, and we hope that it's going to be changed on the committee of National Committee on the Stocks and Stock Markets when it gets to their authorities and regulatory functions. It should play a big and quite a controversial thought that we voiced before. Unfortunately, it wasn't fully welcomed at the regulator. We need to take into consideration that now more than 50% of assets, commercial banks, they now are the ownership of state banks, and Ukrainian banking system is very concentrated, and we need privatization, we need capital, and there's a question rise whether we would like to create access for European markets in one way regime, because once again we need European banks, we need European capital, because European capital will be more eager to work with Ukrainian banks, and this is the key progress I think that could help us in after-war recovery process. This is the key point. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Vitaly, please, if you want to respond to this very quickly. Yes, I have a very quick comment. We don't have such a closed market for European banks. We have a list of even small banks that you could buy out if you would want to. If we had investors that were ready to come to Ukrainian market, I think they would have an opportunity to come in by purchasing a small bank and then develop it. I think we're somehow open to this. Well, really, this is about a radical level of openness, because just to allow European banks, well, you said yourself that the level of potential security, it is much higher, just to let them work in Ukraine without opening representation, without buying out and so on. That's what we mean. interesting idea.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Let's finish this part and finally go to Miss Olga has been waiting for quite a long time when we start our part on digital services. I want to invite Mr. Yufimenko as well. Andrei, please help our colleague with the presentation clicker. So Stanislav Yufimenko, he is an expert of Institute of Economic Research. Please, Stanislav, you start. And the microphone.
Всім доброго дня.
Hello,
Отже,
everyone.
єдиний цифровий ринок є,
So,
ми
single
можемо на слайді побачити
digital market, we can
декілька,
see on the slide
я би
here a
сказав,
few,
головних
I would say, key
стовпів, на яких він
key
тримається.
pillars on which it stands. First, very briefly on each of them, this is electronic communications, and here we need unified standards. We need to synchronize frequencies, which is unfortunately not possible, most likely because part of the frequencies are occupied or used by the military, and after the end of the war, we need to free them up in order for us to implement 5G correctly for us and also share with our neighbors so they don't have any problems. Then next element is electronic identification and mutual recognition of electronic signatures and digital ID. And here Ukraine shows a big progress because Ukraine is the only country that is not in EU and that is taking part in the development of internal EU standards that now has the agreement that our partners, they can voluntarily recognize our electronic signatures, and us in our turn, we recognize European standards. In cybersecurity, a lot of work is undergoing in this regard because first it was a directive NIS 1 that was partially adopted in Ukrainian legislation, but not that long ago. Directive NIS 2 was adopted, and as far as I know, there is an undergoing work on preparation of the draft bill that is supposed to implement this directive in our legislation. Personal data protection, this is also requires legislation, and also these 2 points where us in European Union might have certain problems due to the partially the US because now we have the directive on digital markets and services, and it is partially focusing on collection of taxes in the place where the digital services provided. So if Google is providing services in Ukraine, so for Ukraine to get taxes from this service. And now Donald Trump is threatening partially to European Union in countries that have signed similar agreements, saying that he's going to increase the duties unless these taxes are cancelled. And another pillar that is quite actively being developed and future changes are ahead of us. This is the artificial intelligence. European Union has adopted AI Act. We also have adopted our digital strategy, but Ukrainian legislation, well, it is planned that is going to be formed throughout 2-3 years. But the thing is that the last years after AI Act was adopted in European Union, we haven't seen any big digital models. There's a chance that the trend for deregulation that is now taking its beginning in European Union can also touch upon the AI Act. And in the future, it might have changes because such amount of regulation that is introduced by European Union, it is quite significantly slowing down the creation process of new products due to the need of very detailed inspection of all the AI models. And as of 2023, the report that the Ukrainian side was publishing, overall, we have to adopt approximately 500 acts of EU in digital sphere. 371 doesn't, they don't require implementation, but we need to partially also inspect them because some of those acts, they don't require adoption within the accession to EU, but it is obligatory for the EU members. So after we become one, we also must comply with them. So 29 acts are fully implemented and approximately close to 100 they require implementation. As we can see, part of them are already undergoing. So what has already been done, partially already mentioned and covered this, that Ukraine became the first non-EU country to be included in the EU trust list. This is a very positive indicator. Also, European Union is recognizing high level of Ukraine's expertise and ratings of digital transformation and engagement of citizens in state processes. Also, for the last years, we have adopted the laws that bring us closer to the EU, but what has to be done as well is to finalize the legislation on personal data protection, also prepare for 5G implementation. But here, most likely, we need to prepare the legislative base because on practice, as I mentioned, this is impossible to be done before the war is over because the needed frequencies, we cannot free them up and prepare for harmonization of legislation with AI Act, European AI Act, and possibly propose to deregulate a little bit, even though we understand that our negotiations with the EU, this is not the process where we can say that something we take in, something we don't really want to take in. We have to adopt all the European acts, and we can only maybe speak about such periods of transitional points of agreement, and also updating cybersecurity legislation, adoption of NIS2 directive. And, well, recommendations for the government. It's quite similar to what I've been mentioning. For business, first of all, it's important to prepare for 5G networks, to roll out these networks, because it's going to be business who's going to be doing that. They would have to be ready to purchase equipment, do testing. Also, business needs to use the European opportunities on financing that exist because it is quite limited in Ukraine, while European funds, they might be open to this. And as for the European Union, we should we should analyze in detail the results of our screening
потрібні саме для
not only to look
вступу до
into
ЄС,
those
також
acts that are needed
подивитись на те,
for
що
the
ми
accession
маємо
to
буде
EU, but also look into
прийняти саме вже як член Європейського
uh,
Союзу.
into those
Дякую.
matters and
Дякую,
those
Станіславе.
regulations that have to be
Пані
adopted
Ольго,
as
яка
parts of
ваша
European
оцінка ситуації
Union as
в цій
members.
галузі, будь
Thank you,
ласка.
Mr. Stanislav. Miss Olga, what is your assessment of this area? Hello, starting from 2019, when the Ministry of Digital Transformation was created, one of the key goals was to integrate Ukraine into single digital market with EU. Since then, we aligned and developed and agreed on a roadmap, and it's been 5 years, and the situation, first of all, has changed in the EU, and the legislation is quite dynamic and is developing, and for the last years, many acts of EU, they have changed. And most of the key things that Stanislav was mentioning right now, those are the new acts that have appeared after 2022. After another thing, this is full-scale invasion, of course, and certain complications that are on our way to implementation of the legislation following the roadmap. And one of the also issues, for example, is freeing up the frequencies to proceed, and we're getting ready for the negotiation process when it gets to digital transformation that is connected to digital transformation and media. We're looking into this opportunity into implementation of access for the freeing up the range of 700 megahertz, and we understand that now they're used by special users, which is armed forces of Ukraine. What could we do? It's roaming. It wasn't there in the roadmap, to be honest, and we received recommendations and reports from European Commission what to include, what not to include, and they said that roaming was not timely right now. It was not relevant, and it's quite a complex, and European countries, they were preparing for this for 10 years, so Ukraine is not ready, but as common practice showed, and agreements between different providers, European and Ukrainian ones, this is real, and this is a joint agreement that is voluntarily between the operators, and we're reviewing it every half a year, and the report from European regulator that is showing that this progress shows positive result. We want for those conditions to stick permanently. For this, we updated the Annex 17 to the agreement, and as I mentioned, as it was mentioned in the block of financial services, so this is the internal market, of course, and trust services, and it's very regulated. And of course, we need a decision from the Committee of Association in Trade, and from the side of EU, they need to, of course, endorse this process, but it's quite more simple than ratification between all the parliaments of all the EU countries. And roaming shows very good progress, and we count on joining this area this year, and all the legislation is already endorsed, and now there are some bureaucratic actions that are being done. And if we talk about single digital market as we have it right now, and within the context of negotiation process and digital aspects, they are actually in every block there, and we heard it from the customs, from financial part, because digitalization stepped forward quite a lot, and each section has certain digitalization components. And analyzing the requests from other ministries that are coordinating some other sections, we understand that the key 3 pillars of integration into this market is cybersecurity, GDPR, and trust services. Cybersecurity is important for us not only when it gets to European integration, but also Russian aggression and protection of our system. Implementation of Directive NI S2, it's very important for Ukraine and for EU, and that's why we put it in the Ukraine facility plan. And this is one of the indicators, and we must implement this directive by the end of the first quarter of this year. At this point in the parliament, there is a project registered, bill registered 11290. This is the bill that we're going to be implementing. It is going to be implementing this indicator. There's also going to be some bylaws. We're working very actively, and we believe that by the end of the first quarter of this year, we will ensure the maximum alignment to the regulation NIS2 to our legislation. If we talk about GDPR, it is in many digital acts as well. As we know, framework bill was adopted in the first reading, but also a question of institution. Strong institution is very relevant, and the National Commission on personal data is very relevant. If we talk about trust services, indeed, we are listed in the trust countries of third countries, and our caps are voluntarily recognized by EU countries, but we strive to show recognition, and we would break it down into two waves of recognition. The first wave is recognition of our caps as improved ones, and it has to happen on the basis of Article 14. So this is a decision of European Commission that Ukrainian cap is meeting the EU cap, and this is going to be mandatory recognition of EU countries of our caps. What do we have to do for this? We need to update the 17.3 document, and it was in the EU last year. They updated the regulation 110. This is about implementation of European wallet and e-identification. There are some bylaws from European Union. Part of them are already adopted, part of them are not, so we're waiting for this to happen, and then we're going to be doing the changes in the agreement on association in the part of trust services. At the same time, we're working with technical lines of our cap, and as Stanislav said as well, we're working within the consortium potential, and we are working on to make our DIA to have in the future to become one of the European wallets for identification. Now we're going through an audit, and we're expecting preliminary results, and preliminary we have passed, but we're waiting for the feedback. So previous legislation that we had to implement, this is the old version of this regulation. We had completed that, and EU assessed it in the end of the last year. We went through the audit. Now we're waiting for the package of update from the EU legislation. We are updating our legislation and going through the audit once again. So we are counting on the following, that this decision of recognition of Ukrainian cap as improved, we will have by the end of this year's very positive view, but more realistic beginning of 2026. If we're talking about recognition of all the trust services of e-identification, we are here probably talking about 2027, because for this to happen, once again, cybersecurity and GDPR is needed. So in the essence, this is the three key pillars that we work within. And if we reflect on the amount of acts that are implemented and not implemented, when we were doing the self-screening procedure, we had approximately 500 acts in work. Now, when we have received the agenda of bilateral meeting by the section 10 that was going to take place in the end of March, it's approximately 100 acts. So we understand that the preliminary focus falls on those 100 acts, and the benchmarks for closing opening is going to be about those acts. And we understand that the base here is the trust, cyber, and GDPR. Thank you, Ms. Olga. Are there any questions from the audience? I see one hand.
Добрий день, Василь Бабич, громадська організація «Легкий бізнес».
Vasil
У мене
Babic,
питання до пані
Joe
Ольги.
Easy Business.
На
I have
опитування
a
теж до
question
ваші колеги-експерти
towards Ms.
щодо
Olga and probably
EU
also
Act
your
і
expert
DSA,
colleague as
Digital
for
Service Act,
EU Act on Digital Service,
щодо AI Act, щодо штучного інтелекту, це дуже
AI
свіже
Act.
регулювання.
So this is quite a fresh regulation that came into force only in August 2024, and in essence, the European Union didn't pose any requirements, but the Ministry of Digital Transformation has been preparing back from 2023. So maybe you will share some steps into this matter, and DSA is also very connected to big social platforms, social networks in Ukraine that is connected to so-called topic of national security and so-called ban of Telegram, what is that is being done and the implementation of this act. So what are you doing in this case? So as for AI, we have developed a white book. We have a certain vision how AI should be developing in Ukraine. Preliminary, of course, we understand that to overregulate the area, it is probably will have not very positive impact on its development. That's why we are forming our vision, our communication with European side, how we're going to be presenting it during the bilateral meeting and negotiation position. If we talk about DSA, DMA, and AI, one of the joint elements of these new acts is creation of regulators. And here we also are conducting analytical work how to do it better, because it is clear that within the conditions of full-scale invasion, the budget has focused on some other priorities, of course, and creation of some new state institutions could be not as easy as we would want it to be. So that's why we are in the process of forming of all of those approaches. When we talk about DSA, DMA, we indeed have been developing the draft law at the point where it was also in the draft stage in the EU. We are also communicating with experts from European Union. We also were visiting events for the candidate countries, and EU says the implementation of those acts, even for the EU, is very, very hard, very complex. They didn't expect them to adopt it that fast, and they are proposing certain roadmaps for us. We're creating mappings. We are looking into what particular players is going to influence in Ukraine. Also, there is the process of identification of players, because in those regulations, there's a certain percentage of EU population for us, how to count this. First of all, we haven't really updated that data on population, and it's very hard to tell what amount of people you should be basing this to in Ukraine. So it's quite a comprehensive matter. We're communicating with European Union, but DSA, DMA, they're not pushing us at this point. They understand all of the complexity. There's no such push if we compare it to GDPR or some others. We also talked to the Montenegro that have closed their Section 10 in negotiations, and we also communicated in the part on how they agreed to the implementation, how do they manage as for the implementation of new acts. And they said that they closed the section preliminary basing on those benchmarks that were put a few years ago during the opening of such sections of acts. So there's also not too much clarity, but we're communicating with the European Commission and trying to find win-win solution for us and for the EU to recognize such things as implemented.
Дуже дякую.
Thank you very much.
Будемо завершити наш
We
сьогоднішній
are
захід.
going to
Я
wrap up
хочу
our
запросити
today's
для
event.
заключного
And
слова
for
голову
the
управління
closing
ІАК,
remarks, I would like
Ігоря
to
Бураковського.
invite
І
Igor
також
Burakovsky,
хочу,
who is the
Ігорю
head
Валентиновичу,
of
вас
the
попросити
IED.
відповісти на
And
одне запитання,
Igor
яке ми
Valentinovich, I will
отримали в
also ask you
Zoom
to
від
answer
наших
another
глядачів.
question that we
Воно
received in
звучить
Zoom
таким чином.
from
На
our
недавній конференції в
participants,
Брюсселі,
and
окрім загальних
it is the
необхідних
following.
вимог щодо реформ
The
і
recent
гармонізації
conference in
законодавства
Brussels,
для відкриття
except for for the overall requirements for the reforms and harmonization of legislation for opening negotiation clusters. EU also reminded of certain requirements, softening the limitations within the framework of martial law, and also they pointed out strengthening the opposition rights and also said to work with Hungarian requirements. What is going to be your answer, your comments about these three requirements, since it is not that relevant to the sectors we were talking about? Maybe you can comment to this. As someone who doesn't work with AI, I'm going to talk about policy without such details. So I just want to remind you, remember back in the summer 2024, Hungary came out with pretty much ultimatum, and they put out 12 requirements. It's about social minorities, and you know this is an infinite topic. And as of today, Ukraine has prepared a political announcement that they will take these into consideration. They will be also working on this within the framework of negotiation process. And as far as I remember it, I met it in the media. This step was welcomed by the Hungarian side. So we can believe that we found some mutual understanding how it's going to be fixed. Of course, we will have to see every day. We have the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs from Hungary, and also those questions were raised. And then when we talk about political issues, when we talk about the issues that are connected to the state of Ukrainian policy on softening certain conditions, this is the issues that are being discussed with our partners throughout the whole war. And in fact, then there are some problems that are connected to the limitation of certain rights and freedoms during martial law. But I don't think anyone is confused in this regard. I think everyone understands. And as far as I understand, the question is about following up on the information, because during the war, a lot of registries were closed and not functioning. So as of today, from one side, our partners, and not only us as residents, we want to know how those registries were closed and whether it's possible to reopen them, what can be already now without interfering with the military security of the country. So such issues might appear, and when we're going to be talking about the chapter that is connected to fundamental rights and freedoms, I think those matters will still stay there. And there are a lot of issues connected to this. If we remember this correctly, one of the requirements to the country that is joining the EU, Ukraine, that has to have not only the economy that can be resilient when it gets to competition pressure, and also be democratic. And quite honestly, I don't see any big things in this matter. And today I'm more worried about how the EU will be reacting to the factual, almost form new policy from Trump, and European policy as well. And I believe, to be honest, I will not say threats, because I'm an optimist, but a very big level of uncertainty that we have received as of today. So that's it. Can we move to the second part? Okay, so dear colleagues, I would like to say thank you to everyone who took part in the preparation of this document. I wanted to remind us once again, we want it or we don't want it, but the association agreement with the European Union, the work is undergoing, it's not going anywhere, and all of those things that we committed to do, we're going to continue doing. And negotiations, they're just, so to say, they're just adding an extra layer to what has to be done. And the second thing in the sphere that we've been discussing today is that European legislation is very significantly and very rapidly changing. Some new legislative acts and AI is developing, and some issues appearing that are connected to cryptocurrency, which is pretty much connected to the development of technologies mostly, and many other issues where Ukraine has to react to this in a proper manner. and also more understand in more detail on of all of those processes that are happening in European Union. This is also very important because what we are now taking outside of negotiation process, still sooner or later we will encounter this, and we have to be ready to cooperate with European Union. And Ukraine, that is in fact joining European Union, has to work on forming that such joint approaches. And the third thing, I would like to say thank you to everyone who has joined us today. I would like to say thank you, Institute of Economic Research, for this work and for organizing this event, and the interpreters and people that were organizing this event. Technically, you see, it is matching our topic today. And also I would like to say thank you once again to International Renaissance Foundation, because I believe that they significantly changed the paradigm of their work. So most of their efforts, they go into specific issues that are connected to Ukraine accession to the EU, and this is in different formats. And I think support of such expert work, this is something very important. And our participation in different types of projects, they show that negotiations as for the accession to the EU, it's a big technical work, and it has to be inspected and accountable, and has to be connected to not only what we're told, but our understanding must be there how the regulation is happening in the EU, which is quite complex, and without that it's very hard to think about any progress forward. And I also would like to say thank you to European Union, Brussels, and the representatives in Ukraine, because for us, Ukraine and our institute has really built a good working relationship. And this is very important because on the one hand, we understand what is expected from us, and on the other hand, we help our European partners to understand that Ukraine is valuable for European Union, and the sooner we do this, the better. Thank you. I also wanted to say thank you as well and invite you for coffee. Please.